Hello everyone. Tonight we're going to start with the hidden world that existed behind the walls of convents, where chastity and piety were taught but not always followed. For although the Middle Ages left behind magnificent cathedrals and holy texts, they also left behind court documents, confessions and correspondence that show a much less pious side of medieval nuns, one that includes covert pregnancies, covert lovers, escape tunnels, and even full-fledged orgies carried out in the name of spiritual ecstasy. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Additionally, tell me in the comments what time it is for you and where you are tuning in from. Seeing who is joining us from around the globe is always exciting. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. A woman was supposed to leave the outside world behind when she entered a medieval monastery. She also gave up her right to ever again receive physical intimacy, along with her gowns, jewelry, and last name. Theoretically, she became Christ's wife. In reality, the marriage was frequently ambiguous. Chastity was a serious commitment that included neither flirtation nor touching. No meeting with Brother Thomas from down the hill at midnight in the cloister garden. However, promises are only as enforceable as the will to keep them, as any competent historian or a bishop suffering from a headache would tell you. Additionally, the will in many convents was adaptable. The chastity vow was viewed as more of a suggestion by several nuns. After all, things can become hazy if you're confined for decades inside stone walls with just other women and the odd, curiously attractive confessor around. Really hazy? Some people used their imagination. There were hushed claims that if affection wasn't deliberate, it didn't count. Others leaned into gaps in their spirituality. Who could be against a little passion, whether mystical or not, if Christ was your heavenly husband? Particularly if you recorded it in Latin. Church officials' reports, which were sent to ensure that everything was holy and pure, frequently included tactfully worded grievances such as unescorted male visitors to the orchard or inappropriate intimacy amongst sisters. In other words, there was misbehavior, and it was most likely occurring close to the apples. Convents, which functioned more like aristocratic dorms, came next. Rich families would send off their unruly girls, obviously expecting that their zeal would be handled by someone else. Convents made an effort. Some shrugged and wished the bishop would not come too frequently. Of course, not every nun strayed. Many lived genuinely devout lives, praying, studying, and baking bread that could dent a helmet. Others, though, assumed that they viewed the chastity rule in the same way as people do now when they consider endless breadsticks. Indeed, chastity was promised before God, woven into the rule books and inscribed in ink. Sometimes, however, things were revised behind those silent walls. Generally speaking, pregnancy is hard to justify, and it's particularly harder for nuns. An expanding belly was far more difficult to hide under a habit, and much more difficult to explain without pointing fingers at least one person, multiple sins, and often a bewildered donkey. In contrast, you could hide a secret lover or smuggle in a wheel of illegal cheese. Though reality had different ideas, medieval convents were supposed to be places of celibacy. Bishopric complaints, church records, and genuinely scandalized abbesses all point to the same conclusion. Nuns were becoming pregnant, nor figuratively nor hypothetically, unquestionably, inconveniently, and physically pregnant. The justifications were frequently inventive. Demon possession was asserted by some. Others mentioned miraculous conception, which involved choir director Brother Jacques, and was viewed with suspicion when it occurred 3 cities over, although being technically feasible in biblical tradition. According to one nun, she even fell on a man. Gravity is hard to argue with. Convents typically reacted with fear and deliberate memory loss after being found. The expectant nun would either be placed on retreat or suffer from an unexpected, protracted illness that necessitated complete isolation. The infant might be taken away under the cover of darkness if she gave birth, either to a home for foundlings, a sympathetic relative, or, in the worst circumstances, nowhere nice at all. Some infants were quietly buried on convent grounds with headstones that read like vague apologies to God. The father? That was always the next question, and the answers varied. Priests, travelling nobles, gardeners. The accused in one famous trial was a travelling musician with a harp and a lewd smile. No additional justification was required or provided. The same was true of punishment. Nuns who are peasant-born may be excommunicated and banished in shame. Sisters of noble birth, however, were frequently given harsh warnings and a sabbatical. Despite being caught with a boyfriend and a child, one particularly brash abbess was able to maintain her position. It's obvious that management was different in those days. Naturally, the church maintained that these were unique, uncommon, terrible, and extremely regrettable occurrences. The archival paper trail, however, contradicts this. Particularly, when it is drenched in controversy, parchment is truthful. The power of immobility was something that medieval convents undervalued. In the monastery, love was a delicate business, coded, silent, and written in a flowery Latin that could be a passionate prayer or a romantic confession. Nuns may have taken vows of silence, but their quills, far less obedient. Letters were everything. Love found its way through ink and wax when in-person trysts were too dangerous and meaningful glances across the church were no longer satisfying. Some got through the cloister walls' crevices, others were passed through suspiciously helpful amateurs with good poker faces or tucked into loaves of bread. The contents ranged from sweet to unprintable. One nun expressed her desire to sip from her priest-lover's chalice of devotion in a letter. To be sure, the bishop looking into the matter was so uneasy that he had the letter burnt twice. These covert relationships weren't always short-lived either. A few persisted for years. After outliving 2 abbesses and at least 3 unsuccessful attempts to apprehend her, a nun in France kept up a communication with a young nobleman for more than 10 years. After quoting Ovid in the convent's choir book a bit too correctly, she was eventually apprehended. The church, of course, did not approve of this literary desire. Excommunication, penance, seclusion to solitary prayer, or worse, a mandatory public reading of the letters in front of the convent as a whole, may have been more humiliating than divine judgment, were the punishments meted out when letters were found. What about the lovers? They were typically moved to a less romantic, colder position if they were men of the cloth. One was once flogged, fined, and told not to speak to women of the cloth or any other kind again if they were laymen. His response, "Am I still able to write?" The instances in which love letters were intercepted and circulated like medieval gossip columns were much more unpleasant. Imagine spending hours writing your most cherished feelings just to have a laughing novice read them out loud while enjoying cheese and mead. The ink continued to flow, however, because love used metaphor, innuendo, and extremely determined handwriting to adapt when walls were high and eyes were on the wall. Convents were supposed to be strongholds of chastity. As it turned out, it resembled a boarding school with walls and, in some situations, a surprisingly large number of escape routes. Medieval nuns weren't spiritually restless. Some were physically inventive. Furthermore, you would be mistaken to imagine delicate women tiptoeing through a rose garden gate. Some of these escape attempts included crawling via underground drains, bribing guards, using bedsheets to scale walls, and, in one instance, disguising oneself as a monk and leaving the house through the front door as if it were any other Tuesday. The reasons differed. Some ran away to be with their beloved again. Some just detested life in monasteries. When they realized that perpetual silence, even throughout meals, meant just that, a handful of them wanted to go back home. Sister Benedetta of Verona is arguably the most fabled escapee of all. She attempted to escape 3 times before being sent to the convent at the age of 14. On her 3rd attempt, she fabricated travel documents, pretended to be a novice from a nearby convent, and fled on a vegetable cart. Because she persisted in trying to flirt with the guard, rather than because of her disguise, she reportedly got it halfway to Venice before being apprehended. There were more spectacular escapes. A collective breakout was organized by nuns in Saxony after their abbess outlawed music. They disappeared into the woods after using a loaf of stale bread to overwhelm the gatekeeper. They were later labeled disoriented and unrepentant by church authorities, which, to be honest, sounds like the title of a great medieval drama. When discovered, runaway nuns were typically dragged back and endured a lovely mix of fasting, public humiliation, and being imprisoned in a chilly stone room with only a crucifix and disappointment. There were a lot of repeat offenders who might be sent to more rigid convents with taller walls and harsher meals. However, for some, that was insufficient to put out the rebellion. Some nuns managed to flee, wed their boyfriends, and spent the rest of their lives acting as though they had never seen, much less resided in, a cloister. Because there were instances when the window was open and the habit simply didn't fit. Every scandal has its symbol, and Sister Agnes of Würzburg needs her own stained glass window, ideally one that blushes in the history of convent misconduct. According to all accounts, Agnes was a bright and endearing nun who had a remarkable talent for devotion, music, and, for more than a year, housing a knight in her cell. Yes, a real knight, with armor, a sword, and most likely a tragic past. We do know that he was supposedly recuperating from war wounds, but his name has been lost to history, which is odd in and of itself. It's unknown exactly where this combat took place. After he stumbled while attempting to enter covertly, it might have been in the convent courtyard, a pub, or a field. The records of the bishop indicate that the knight was found after a novice heard odd clanking sounds coming from Agnes's cell. Following an investigation, church officials discovered the man humming hymns, eating preserved figs, and hiding behind a tapestry. Sister Agnes, who heals both body and soul, is his sole line of defense. Agnes did not deny the romance to her credit. She actually appeared genuinely irritated by the interruption. She claimed that she was helping the injured and that compassion is a sacred virtue, a claim that is rarely made to defend living with a man who is chained. Not only was the romance scandalous, but it also lasted for 12 months, during which the knight was spotted at least twice donning a borrowed monk's robe and assisting with garden work. The affair lasted for a few weeks, and even a covert meeting was acceptable. That required preparation and dedication. The repercussions was dramatic and quick. Agnes was demoted, publicly humiliated, and placed under a more stringent directive. The knight was punished and banished, but according to one account, he laughed the entire time and did not appear remorseful, possibly the most medieval way to put it. Later, Agnes published letters criticizing the hypocrisy of the church, citing medical and biblical passages to support her claims. One line stood out: "Had I let him die, I'd be a sinner still." Not all medieval convent scandals involved secret letters or sly knights. Some claimed to be in communication with the divine, and they trembled, moaned, sobbed, and were louder in public. Here comes the mystical nun. Some nuns in the Middle Ages were renowned for experiencing intense religious visions. These were no ordinary times of introspection. No, they were full-bodied, trembling on the floor, eyes rolled back spiritual encounters. And some church leaders questioned them, while others referred to them as sacred. Why, above all, did these visions sound so excited? For example, the Low Country nun's sister Beatrix reported that Christ visited her every night, physically, not figuratively. Beyond the material world, she wrote about spiritual unity and hugs of divine warmth. She declared herself married to the Lamb at one point, which may seem innocent until you read the passages in which she likened his presence to fire that spread both inside and outside of her. Delicate. Then there is Hadewijch of Antwerp, a mystic from the 13th century whose poetry is reminiscent of a sultry romance novel in the Middle Ages if the entire book was set in a chapel. She described being pierced by divine light and consuming love. Later church scholars attempted to modify some of her statements into more suitable analogies because they were so vivid. However, the original versions have been retained, which raises questions. Not all nuns, to be fair, pretended to be in ecstasy. A lot of them were real. Intense emotional connections with Christ were encouraged by medieval theology, which occasionally used language that would be classified as PG-13 by contemporary readers. However, sincerity does not negate the fact that these visions sparked significant spiritual and non-spiritual awakenings. Not everybody was impressed. These women were accused of attention-seeking by some bishops. Others were concerned about the impact these visions had on nuns who were younger and more vulnerable. They were described as frenzy masquerading as sanctity by one archbishop who was especially skeptical. Perhaps since he expressed what everyone else was thinking, he was later reassigned. Nevertheless, a few mystic nuns rose to fame. They were able to write supernatural fan fiction and pass it off as theology because their visions were documented, replicated, and revered. Medieval monasteries were renowned for their ability to exercise restraint of the tongue, the body, and particularly the stomach. It was considered a virtue to fast. Feeling hungry, it is advisable to leave this temptation in the snake's garden. However, within certain convents, fasting was recommended more throughout the day, because a new kind of ritual started when the bells ceased to ring and the abbess went to her chamber, the feast that was prohibited. Convents were expected to follow a rigorous diet. Desserts include bread, porridge, the occasional fish, and an existential dilemma. Generally speaking, meat, rich cheeses, sweets, and alcohol were prohibited, particularly during Lent, or the dozens of fasting days that constituted about half the year. However, let's face it, nobody can eat boiled cabbage indefinitely without making plans. And they plotted. A few nuns created secret networks of cooks. Salted meats for medical purposes were delivered by amiable merchants. Consecrated vinegar was the new name for wine. The purpose of honey cakes was to serve guests who, for some reason, never showed up. 3 wheels of cheese, a jug of cherry wine, a whole ham, and 2 ducks were all part of one surviving convent inventory. It was listed in the liturgical supply catalogue. You are free to make your own judgments. Feasts at midnight became common. Imagine this. Deep within the convent, a room with candles and giggling nuns whispering psalms in between roasted goose bits. When a novice allegedly burned her fingers while smuggling hot pastries out of the oven, she attempted to justify it as a divine punishment. The pastries were reportedly quite good, yet no one purchased it. These feasts occasionally turned into social events attended by priests, merchants, visiting men, and occasionally individuals who had no formal cause to be at a convent after midnight. It was discovered that one monastery in Burgundy was holding prohibited parties, which were actually typical Saturday night feasts with dancing, gambling, and what the bishop tactfully referred to as improper revelry. Naturally, not all nuns participated. While many were truly pious and appalled by such luxury, others, let's just say, thought that fasting meant eating as fast as possible to avoid being caught. Few things unnerved medieval church authorities more than a nun with a bump. Unless, of course, that bump turned into a baby and then into a shallow grave beneath the convent pantry. Rumors of unusual noises emanating from the cellar of a French monastery in the 14th century gave rise to one of the most terrifying scandals. There wasn't vermin or faulty plumbing, rather there was something wailing that shouldn't have been there, as one appalled beginner put it. When church investigators showed up, they anticipated the typical a stockpile of alcohol, some cheese that was prohibited, and perhaps a few of love letters. They discovered a barrel of pickled cabbage underneath a hastily excavated piece of disturbed ground. The body of a newborn kid was beneath it, wrapped in the sister's headpiece, which was obviously a torn wimple. The inference was not nuanced. The ensuing inquiry was as fragile as a cart of pestilence. Although a number of nuns were moved soon after, which is a frequent euphemism for, "Please disappear quietly before this becomes a trial," the mother was never given an official name. When asked, the abbess said she didn't know. She stood over a strangely well-used sink and said, "I was not told of any childbirth." One of the oldest and least successful reasons in the scandal playbook, she continued, is that any lady who gave birth in the convent had obviously entered already pregnant. This was not a singular occurrence. Hidden pregnancies sometimes led to disastrous outcomes throughout Europe. Monasteries left their infants at their doors. Some were smuggled to relatives who were supportive. Tragically, some did not live long enough for either. In response, the Church displayed its typical mix of selective forgetfulness and indignation. Silent transfers and public penance were among the forms of punishment. However, many of these stories were buried, both literally and symbolically, as long as the walls remained high and the letters remained secret. Nevertheless, there was always the remote chance of another finding if a pantry was rearranged or a cellar repaved. A tiny scandal wrapped in linen and silence. Opening a brothel falls somewhere between heresy and hurling a bishop out a window on the list of things nuns were not allowed to do. However, Sister Clara, a former nun in Bologna in the 15th century, decided she had had enough of virtue, veils, and vows. Since subtlety was evidently not part of the business model, she left the convent and created a very profitable brothel in her former convent building, maintaining the customs. To begin with, Clara hadn't exactly been cloister material. She is described in church records as stubborn and often missing vespers. In other words, she did not attend prayer and may have had plans involving wine and a man named Marco. She didn't make a big deal out her leaving the convent. She just left and never came back. Later, when onlookers saw the convent had unexpectedly gained a lot of popularity among males who had no recognized interest in theology, the true drama started. A local magistrate claimed that Clara operated the business with military efficiency and hired women, some of whom were former nuns, and others who were simply creatively unemployed. Costumes were apparently more expensive for customers. No one was ready to address the theological problems raised by some men's requests for the complete confession experience. Panic broke out in the church when word got out. This brothel had the audacity to appear like a monastery and operated more efficiently than other monasteries, not because prostitution was uncommon. It wasn't. The visuals were awful. When asked to explain herself, Clara just shrugged and remarked, "At least nobody here acts like they're chaste." To be sure, she was excommunicated and then excommunicated again. It seems like a strange decision, but possibly poetic justice, that Clara was purportedly transported to a nunnery far from Bologna once the premises was seized and the business was destroyed. Her legacy persisted nevertheless. The location was referred to informally as the Cloister of Delight for many years. Even obscene performances and songs featured it. Clara, the nun who chose hospitality over salvation, became somewhat of a folk legend despite the church's efforts to bury her legacy. The spiritual reset button of medieval Catholicism was confession. It was meant to be a serious practice of introspection, humility, and penitence for a nun. Theoretically, you left lighter after kneeling and whispering your sins to the priest, who then provided absolution. However, in reality, sometimes confession resulted in more sins than it pardoned. The confessor scandal is a type of misconduct that is so prevalent that it almost has become a cliché. The setup was easy. Numerous nuns, a single priest, and a closed room reserved especially for private discussion regarding temptation. What might go wrong? Quite a lot, it turns out. If the nun was young, nervous, or from a wealthy family, whose power would shield them both, some confessors took their spiritual responsibilities very seriously, while others saw ministering to the soul as an open invitation to explore the rest of the nun's emotional landscape. There were heavy curtains, porous boundaries, and only theoretical ecclesiastical monitoring. In one notorious instance, Father Anselm of Tours listened to 30 nuns' confessions and somehow managed to establish a unique spiritual bond with 10 of them. When Sister Magdalene came out of confession, laughing and with a subtle clove wine odor, the abbess started to suspect something. Rumors of improper behavior spread throughout Europe. It was discovered that some confessors met with nuns at strange hours. Love letters disguised as theological inquiries were sent to others. According to reports, one was found placing his hand on a novice's knee while he examined her for indications of demonic possession. At least it's creative. How did the church react? Reassignment after a delicate stillness. In medieval times, a confessor who was accused of misbehavior was typically sent to another diocese to reflect, which implied that they should attempt to avoid being caught this time. The nuns were left in uncomfortable positions in the meanwhile. Others were completely held accountable, charged with using feminine appeal to woo the priest, which frequently meant being under 30. Some opted for quiet over holiness and refused to confess again at all. Not all confessions, of course, ended in controversy. However, the setup, male dominance, female subservience, and private discussions was essentially a cry to abuse, particularly when it was veiled in Latin and incense. Convent mischief wasn't always about lust and flesh. Part of it was in the guise of dubious, helpful nuns who had access to plants that could end a pregnancy or cure a headache. There were herb gardens in almost every convent. It was a regular occurrence in monastic life. Nuns created herbal cures, tinctures, and balms to treat everything from stomachaches to demonic possession, but their success with the latter was not always consistent. However, in many societies, these lowly healers became convent chemists, and the distinction between medicine and mischief started to become hazy. They were called the apothecary sisters, and they knew their plants, sometimes too well. Many received training in the covert use of herbs like azrue, tansy, and pennyroyal, known as abortifacients, to correct abnormal cycles. The official answer was always ambiguous, of course. The potion was intended to treat a persistent humoral imbalance or a neurological disease. However, when a nun came to the herbarium after muttering in a weak voice and with a flushed face, everyone understood what it meant. Some convents have a reputation as discreet havens for women with sensitive issues. When a noblewoman with an awkward pregnancy decides to go on a spiritual retreat, she may come out 2 months later appearing strangely thinner and much more pious. Particularly well known was Sister Hildegard of Trier, who was characterized in documents as a very discreet herbalist. One extremely apprehensive male witness claimed that her mixtures might soothe a restless body, stop an annoying cough, or reverse the effects of the flesh. The poetic phrasing had to be appreciated. The Church did not formally agree, of course. However, few bishops inquired as long as the patients left looking appreciative rather than expectant. It was simpler to believe that the sisters were just exceptionally skilled at teas. However, there were more sinister rumors, tales of love spells made with hair and bone, or medicines poured into wine. Most were probably overstated. However, certain convents were investigated for having witch-like tendencies, which was not the kind of assessment you wanted from your local inquisitor in 15th century Europe. Being in the public eye was a spiritual risk for the majority of medieval nuns. However, for some, it became legally required, particularly when their private offences resulted in court cases. Convents were sometimes forced into secular courts throughout Europe. The reasons were different: property feuds, dowry claims, inheritance issues, and, more embarrassingly, cases involving extramarital affairs, pregnancy, and conduct unfit for a Christ-follower wife. That final phrase was used frequently. For someone who had been up to anything, it was medieval legal code. A nun named Sister Constanza sued a priest in Florence for breach of promise in one very noteworthy case. Tragically, she claimed, he pledged to resign from the clergy after seducing her in the confessional. She supplied letters, observers, and extremely incisive poetry. The court was so agitated that it postponed making a decision for 3 years in the hopes that all parties would pass away or make a vow of silence. In a different instance in Cologne, an abbess was charged with embezzling convent funds to purchase gifts for guests, spiced wine, and opulent bedding. The guests were male, under 30, and remarkably well-groomed for pilgrims, it turned out. The trial documents resemble an upscale hotel's spending report. The objects were for spiritual hospitality, according to the abbess. The court didn't agree. The church occasionally made an effort to keep things internal. The purpose of canon law was to deal with mischievous nuns. However, secular judges had to intervene when crimes like theft, child abandonment, or contract fraud crossed into civil domain. These judges were frequently unprepared for veiled women quoting scripture while denying everything with holy wrath. In Burgundy, a nun was accused of assaulting another nun because of a male. She used a 2-for-1 defense during interrogation, claiming she had been possessed by the devil and envy, which earned her a relocation and less penance. Usually these judicial dramas were put to rest as soon as possible. Word always got out, even if the church didn't want to promote its internal soap operas. Phrases like, "Did you hear about the nun with the wine bill?" would reverberate around the local bars. Or, "She went to court with her boyfriend and her dowry." Relics were the medieval equivalent of certified badges in a society where few people could read and even fewer could fact-check. Some convents gathered them with all the restraint of a contemporary teen at a discount store. Drops of saintly blood, holy bones, and shreds of cloth attracted pilgrims, donations, and attention. Relics were considered sacred links to heaven by many nuns. Others viewed them more as sources of income. Consider Abbess Euphemia of Thuringia, who asserted that a fragment of Mary Magdalene's hairbrush was kept at her convent. It is a grooming tool from the most misunderstood lady in Scripture, not a piece of the veil or a splinter of the actual cross. Euphemia urged pilgrims to bow before it and leave money, describing it as having a perfume reminiscent of heaven. Upon closer examination, the bishop found that it most likely belonged to a local merchant and had a subtle goat and rosemary scent. Then there is the Bruges convent that proudly showed off the toothache promoter St. Apollonia's fingernail. Upon closer inspection, researchers discovered that it was actually a piece of cow horn. In a daring theological turn, to put it mildly, the abbess maintained that the miracle resulted from confidence in the relic's concept rather than the relic itself. Some nuns developed a lot of creativity. Centuries later, one claimed to have a handkerchief that the Virgin Mary had used, still wet from tears. Even though she lived in a convent hundreds of miles away from any known commerce route, another vowed she was a thorn from the crown of thorns. She merely grinned and replied, "The Lord provides," when asked how she got it. These artifacts weren't all fakes, to be fair. Some were very old, enigmatic, and perhaps sacred. But the sheer volume of relics claimed by convents, including 6 different skulls of John the Baptist and 3 navels of Christ, suggests that enthusiasm occasionally outpaced accuracy. Coins clinked, pilgrims arrived, relics worked, and convents that were unable to draw guests with sermons discovered that bones, real or not, made for great marketing. It wasn't all repentance and rosaries inside the walls of the monastery. While feigning a strong interest in stitching, some nuns were managing land, administering soft power empires, conducting correspondence, and outwitting bishops. These sisters weren't your typical ones. They were abbesses, frequently descended from aristocratic families, and they had a vital insight into medieval life. If you referred to influence as stewardship, it wasn't sinful. Consider Abbess Matilda of Essen, who managed her abbey in a manner akin to a duchy. She received royal guests, arranged property deals, and once corrected a visiting count's Latin in public. She was admired for being both fearsome and devout, which enabled her to accomplish tasks without actually ever leaving the monastery. Large estates were ruled by numerous convents. Although the Church disapproved of women in positions of power, it had no issue with them paying taxes. This left senior nuns and abbesses to handle agriculture, finances, and conflicts with tenant farmers. Like any good landowner, they occasionally falsified a deed or two, bought off local officials, and used blessings to promote advantageous tithing. When a disagreement over fishing rights escalated into a full-fledged holy turf war, one convent in Normandy famously forged its own pact with a neighboring monastery. Scholars have characterized the peace letter written by Sister Julienne, the abbess at the time, as exceptionally incisive for a lady sworn to humility. In other words, she used perfect Latin to burn the abbot. The political matchmaking came next. Often, aristocratic families placed their daughters in convents for strategic reasons rather than out of piety. A nun from the right lineage could serve as a family agent, passing along information, lobbying quietly, or even delaying papal decisions with conveniently lost letters. Some convents had spies, some had lawyers. According to reports, one German abbey had a scribe who was also skilled in fencing, indicating that their copy-editing procedure was particularly rigorous. Naturally, the Church was aware of this and made an effort from time to time, but the hierarchy was powerless to change it as long as the sisters continued to appear to be pious. Even if someone is obviously operating the organization like a velvet-gloved mafia, you cannot excommunicate them for being very capable. Some convents had developed into something like independent cities by the late Middle Ages, complete with economies, hierarchies, secrets, gossip, and yes, the odd baby exchange that took place underground. Not every controversy left behind a mountain of love notes or a seductive smile. Some people wore silence, not the holy kind, but the strategic kind, the type that preserved reputations, that concealed the blood, the sobbing, the unexpected illness, the nun who inexplicably disappeared after becoming unwell, and whose cell was turned over to a new novice in the morning. Because scandal was sometimes procedural rather than vocal. Consider Abbess Theodora, who managed her convent in a manner akin to that of a medieval CEO. She hosted dukes, oversaw domains, and conducted prayer vigils so ornate that seating charts were necessary. She ordered tighter fasting for everyone except herself when 3 of her novices became pregnant in a single year, claiming it was due to spiritual temptation. A terrifying flex, even for the 14th century, she accused local clerics of envy and threatened to deny them intercessory prayer for their souls when they questioned her. Some convents just capitalized on their fame. Outside of Milan, the Abbey of St. Lucilla gradually established a reputation as a haven for reformed women, a nebulous term that referred to former courtesans who now spend 80% of their time in pricey robes and 20% of their time in prayer. They kept real live peacocks in the grounds, charged entrance for feast day processions, and held musical presentations. Rome referred to them as profitable, while the bishop described them as a small worry. One nun in England was so successful at creating indulgences that her scrolls reached York Cathedral, where a bishop blessed them before anyone realized they were printed with berry wine-infused ink. Strange practices were not exclusive to the pious. According to one mystic nun, she only experienced heavenly experiences while she was simultaneously fasting and dancing. After her superior finally outlawed both, she came up with the idea of holy spinning. People believed she was possessed. At 30 revolutions per minute, she maintained that she was only expressing divine delight because behind the scripture and incense there was always something else, raw, unyielding life, clawing its way through the marble's fissures. Diogenes was merely the son of a banker in Sinope, Greece, before he became the most renowned philosopher to live in a barrel. He was literally born into prosperity, which is why he would later scoff at gold and spit on affluence. And, well, that was short-lived. When Diogenes and his father Hecesius were charged with a fairly inventive crime, defacing the local currency, his life took a different path. Not in a symbolic sense, they were charged with actually altering the coins, either by forging or shaving them down. One thing is certain, the local authorities were not amused, and the future cynic was immediately banished. It is still up for discussion whether Diogenes knew exactly what he was doing, or if he was merely assisting Dad with the family business. Being banished from one's hometown would be a sorrow for most individuals. It was a professional move for Diogenes. He escaped to Athens, the Greek world's philosophical epicenter, and made the decision that rather than stumbling back into respectable society, he would tear it apart little by bit with sarcasm, a sharp tongue, and utter contempt for trousers. Plato, Aristotle, and other esteemed intellectuals and sophisticated sophists were all around Athens at the time. Despite being homeless and impoverished, Diogenes didn't give a damn. He rolled into town with a dog-like smile and attitude, exposing every speck of hypocrisy he could detect, as others engaged in linen-robed debates about metaphysics. Dog-like isn't a metaphor either. He accepted it. He really proudly identified with the Greek word kynikos, which means dog-like and is where the name cynic from. He licked the truth unadulterated and raw, biting at convention and barking at corruption. What was his first task? Letting off of all social pretense. Like a philosophical raccoon, he gave up material belongings, ridiculed etiquette, and slept in a huge ceramic jar that is sometimes mislabeled a barrel. It was his final declaration. He was genuinely going to live outside of society if it was a facade. This was not merely rebellion for the sake of rebellion. According to Diogenes, virtue resulted from living in harmony with nature, and nature didn't require wealth, notoriety, or 10-room mansions. All that was required was honesty and perhaps a solid jar. Plato was the golden child of Athens, the epicenter of intellectual prestige. He was refined, admired, and far too solemn for Diogenes' taste. Diogenes was, well, literally and figuratively, peeing on virtues and abstract aspirations while Plato was classifying them. One of the most well-known stories is Plato's attempt to characterize a human being as a biped without feathers. It struck him as a witty synopsis of our species. Always prepared to use ridicule as a weapon, Diogenes grabbed a chicken and carried it into the academy while yelling, "Look, here is Plato's human." Plato had to add, with broad, flat nails, to the definition, because the joke hit him so hard. The man in the jar gets 1 point. Diogenes, however, wasn't merely trolling for attention. He thought that philosophers like Plato had forgotten to live honorably because they were too preoccupied with abstract nonsense. Diogenes believed that virtue should be lived rather than discussed. And if that meant looking homeless and eating onions while taunting the educated elite, then so be it. He regularly interrupted Plato's lectures by carrying a lamp among the crowds during the day and murmuring that he was trying to find an honest guy. The audience chuckled uneasily, knowing in their hearts that he was correct. Despite its marble palaces and democratic aspirations, Athens had devolved into a stage for intellectual performances and courteous lies. Diogenes cut right through it with frankness. According to reports, Plato referred to Diogenes as Socrates gone insane, and it wasn't totally incorrect. Similar to Socrates, Diogenes defied social norms and posed awkward questions. Diogenes, however, opposed a dialogue with Socrates. He desired a show, and if it meant exposing hypocrisy, he was more than willing to play the clown. He gave the ordinary life a ridiculous appearance. He discharged himself wherever he liked, frequently to the dismay of bystanders, ate whatever crumbs he could find, and begged without shame. But every behavior was a philosophical message, no matter how uncivilized. When others felt no shame for lying, deceiving, and hoarding wealth, why should he feel ashamed for his natural functions? Diogenes destroyed the illusions of this world, whilst Plato created perfect ones. He said that this made him the true philosopher. Even if his scent was somewhat of existential dread and stale olives, Diogenes was by this time a full-time philosophical threat. Except for the enormous pottery jar he slept in, which was hidden away in the marketplace like a thoughtful piece of street art, he had no fixed address. Before he saw a youngster drinking water from his hands, he had very little, just a cup, a stick, and a cloak, and he tossed the cup away right away. "I've been beaten by a child in the simplicity of life," he stated. That was Diogenes' problem. He talked about more than just simplicity. Everyone was outsimplified by him. He wasn't hiding silver beneath his mattress and feigning rejection of prosperity. No, he actually slept with the dogs, bathed in rainwater, and survived on leftovers. In fact, he frequently referred to himself as a dog, not as a slight on himself, but as a mark of pride. Dogs don't live with guilt, pretense, or a fixation on status. And Diogenes wanted to live just that way, bark included. Subsequently, he famously carried a lamp, or lantern, depending on the translation, during the day. "What are you doing?" people would inquire. He would complain, searching for an honest man. The subtext, of course, was obvious. He couldn't find one. He had no hope at all. The joke was a slap in the face to everyone who believed they were good people, but were actually living compromised lifestyles. Every motion he made turned into a lesson, and his everyday life became performance art. He reportedly joked, "If only it were as easy to relieve hunger by rubbing my stomach," after being caught masturbating in public. Crude, of course. Diogenes, however, did not consider natural behaviors to be disgraceful. It was hypocrisy. To be clear, Diogenes was not impoverished because he was forced to be. Rich fans offered him food, housing, and even patronage. Like someone evading a pyramid scheme, he rejected them. He believed that taking charity included being bound by duty, and Diogenes would not be restrained, nor by wealth, nor by manners, and most especially not by the clumsy coughs of society when he did something barbaric in public. He didn't live in a marginalized community. He had become a sharp, painful, and unavoidable thorn that had taken root there. Diogenes was proudly displaying his filth while everyone else was busy polishing their masks. And that was the most radical deed of all in a world full of roles and rituals. The most powerful man on the planet and the dirtiest guy in Athens had one of the most famous meetings in ancient philosophy, if not in history. Here comes Alexander the Great, a youthful conqueror with an army to support his godlike ego. Alexander had been captivated by tales of Diogenes. This man drew attention across the Greek world while having nothing, wanting nothing, and having nothing to fear. Alexander had to meet him, of course. Like a stray cat that happened to be skilled in moral philosophy, he saw Diogenes basking in his jar. The famous query, "Is there anything I can do for you?" was posed by the king of Macedon. "Yes, stand out of my sunlight," Diogenes said without even sitting up. Meek down, Alexander's group was appalled. The ruler of the majority of the known world has just been brushed aside by this man like an obnoxious street seller. But he was impressed, Alexander. Legend has it that he turned to his warriors and declared, "I would wish to be Diogenes if I were not Alexander." History instructors frequently quote this type of speech, and YouTube comment sections frequently misrepresent it. But whether or not it is historically accurate, the scene encapsulates Diogenes. He sought nothing at all which made him untouchable in a society that was fixated on power. He had no army, no palace, and no reputation to defend. A man who sleeps in a jar cannot be bought off. A man who begs for food cannot be blackmailed. Furthermore, you can't win over a man who thinks luxury is ridiculous. Diogenes taught Alexander and the rest of the world that genuine strength comes from having no needs and no fears. Diogenes' ultimate rebellion was to deprive life of its most basic necessities and challenge anybody to label him impoverished, rather than to yell in the streets or pee on social conventions. He reduced one of the greatest conquerors in history to a shadow that obscures the sun in a single remark. Diogenes did more than simply advocate for this freedom, in contrast to other philosophers. Even emperors felt insignificant around him because he lived life to the fullest. Imagine then attempting to win over your pals. I wish you luck. Diogenes was more than a local eccentric by this point. Cynicism, a new way of thinking, was personified by him. And not the diluted kind we use nowadays when someone is being sour about politics. The initial cynicism was raw, primal, and tainted with fleas. Diogenes said that because society was founded on falsehoods, it had degenerated into something corrupt. Lies about success, virtue, and happiness. People climbed social ladders, chased wealth, and filled their minds with abstract drivel throughout their lives. After glancing over all of that, Diogenes remarked, "No thanks, I'd rather eat scraps and sleep in a pot." Cynicism was really about coexisting with nature. That meant giving up all manufactured demands, luxury, celebrity, and political aspirations in favor of a simpler, more independent life. Perhaps you didn't need a golden goblet if nature didn't give it to you. Indeed, it was more honest to steal an onion or beg for bread than to flatter a politician if nature provided you a stomach. He also had a very aggressive philosophy. Diogenes did not conceal his opinions in temple scrolls or essays. He lived them out loud. He made fun of, yelled at, and often violently disrupted people's life to make them realize their own inconsistencies. Diogenes would follow people around like a philosophical heckler, revealing the rot behind the silk if they preached virtue, but led extravagant lives. Diogenes believed that deeds were considerably more important than words. "Other dogs bite their enemies," he once remarked. Nothing said friendship like a nice, metaphorical gnaw on the ankle of your fantasies. "Therefore I bite my friends to save them." He was particularly harsh on hypocrisy, particularly in the philosophical community. Diogenes would hold up a mirror, either literally or figuratively, if a scholar asserted that poverty was honorable while enjoying luxury. He reportedly said, "The gods must have gone blind if they need such a grand house," as he watched a lavish temple being constructed. Diogenes was the natural predator of image in a civilization that was fixated by it. He stripped everything down, both literally and symbolically, while others wrapped their aspirations in jargon. He had no desire to win favor. He was attempting to rouse people, and if that meant urinating on sculptures in public or barking like a dog, then so be it. After all, the truth wasn't always courteous. Diogenes was more than just a thinker. He was the filthy, noisy, and incredibly annoying walking conscience of Athens. He was either the lone, sane man in a city full of liars or a madman with problems controlling his bowels, depending on who you questioned. Perhaps both. His profession was to offend people. He once walked barefoot on the pricey carpet in the banquet hall during a feast, brushing the muck from his feet, and muttered, "Thus I trample on Plato's pride." Diogenes saw this as more than just rudeness, but it wasn't precisely RSVP behavior. It was a protest against luxury, vanity, and all the meaningless customs people used to make themselves feel significant. he put everyone to the test. Diogenes mumbled, "That's not charity," when he witnessed a wealthy guy giving to the underprivileged merely to gain admiration. Investment is what that is. He once remarked, "You shouldn't be upset," after witnessing a man become irate after being smacked. All it was flesh on flesh. It was more than philosophy, it was judo for the mind. But Diogenes' true brilliance went beyond his words. It was his way of life. He criticized everything that others took for granted in his day-to-day life. Holding the universe upside down, he waited to see what coins dropped out. Of course, the free classes weren't appreciated by everyone. Though it was like attempting to seize smoke to arrest a man who had nothing and no shame, he was mocked, assaulted, and even taken into custody. In one place, he calmly told the auctioneer, "Sell me to a man who needs a master," after being seized and sold as a slave. Take a moment to process that. Xeniades, the Corinthian man he eventually dated, did more than simply purchase Diogenes. He brought him home and allowed him to manage the family, teach the kids, and basically turn into a snarky live-in life counselor. Diogenes somehow transformed slavery into a series of lectures. Diogenes remained excruciatingly constant, whether he was teasing kings or teaching youngsters. He made fun of all hierarchies of authority, including those he unintentionally joined. He would point out that he was merely a hound, seeking the truth and occasionally urinating on golden statues if someone ever attempted to give him too much praise. He was the irreversible splinter of society. He became more and more ingrained in your conscience the more you attempted to ignore him. It would be like claiming the sun is a little warm to imply Diogenes had strong views on social customs. He didn't simply disregard civility. With the zeal of a preacher without shoes and the cleanliness of a disobedient raccoon, he began a one-man campaign against them. Bathing, dining manners, overrated, useless, shameful, and a cover for hypocrites and cowards behind marble columns. According to Diogenes, most social conventions weren't meant to benefit individuals. They were there to separate the rich from the poor, to manage them, and to humiliate them into conformity. He naturally chose to live in a way that went against all of them. Even in the winter, he frequently strolled barefoot through neighborhoods that were in disarray. He responded, "If I were in need of shoes, I'd be more distressed about my life than my feet," when asked why he didn't wear shoes like the average person. Additionally, and not out of ignorance, Diogenes had a talent for publicly performing unpleasant bodily functions. He was well aware of his actions. These behaviors weren't arbitrary. They were declarations. He felt that something shouldn't be a cause for shame if it was normal and required. To put it another way, your moral compass is faulty if you're going to chastise me for not cheating your neighbor. Begging even turned into a kind of resistance. Diogenes saw begging as a spiritual test, both for himself and the person being begged, in contrast to other beggars who attempted to appeal to sympathy or social duty. It's okay if they gave. If not, that was also acceptable. In any case, he remained hungry and honest. Diogenes, however, was not merely rebelling for the sake of revolt. His entire life was a continuous experiment to determine how little one needed to live comfortably. Not only get by, live a good life, with honor, with liberty, with a sense of humor that can cut through philosophers' elegant rhetoric and politicians' haughtiness. By completely disregarding traditions, he revealed their ridiculousness. Furthermore, he doubled down the more people urged him to act normally, demonstrating that many so-called civilized behaviors were actually merely rituals we carried out to feel better about ourselves. Diogenes was barefaced and most likely barefoot, laughing in the heat and asking us why we weren't in a society that was concerned with masks. Naturally, Diogenes left no temples, marble busts, or memoirs in his honor. They would have been undesirable to him. In fact, he most likely would have spat on any statue that was attempted to be built for him. His legacy is found in what he destroyed rather than what he produced. Egos, pretenses, and illusions. What about his passing? The stories that surround it, like everything else about Diogenes, range from tragic to absurd to incredibly appropriate. According to some, he died by holding his breath because he was bored with life. Some say he died from an infected dog bite, which is ironic for anyone who knows his moniker. Then there is the story in which he just lay down, remained silent, and never got back up. There were no spectacular curtain closes or grand farewell remarks, simply the loudest cynic in the world quietly leaving, as though death itself had not impressed him. Diogenes allegedly said, "Throw me outside the city wall and let the beasts have me," in response to a question about his preferred burial. Someone, shocked, inquired as to whether he was afraid of being torn to pieces by animals. "Not if you give me a stick to chase them away," Diogenes said. But the man noted, "You won't be able to utilize it. So why should I give a damn about what happens to me once I die?" Diogenes. 1. Mortality. 0. Diogenes' teachings persisted for generations after his passing. They quickly spread among those fed up with hypocrisy. Later, Stoics like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius adopted the idea of self-sufficiency and virtue untarnished by wealth or reputation, thanks to his brand of cynicism, which influenced a whole school of thought. Diogenes still seems strangely pertinent in this day and age, when everyone is preoccupied with followers, filters, and money. He serves as a reminder that real freedom comes from requiring less rather than having more. That dignity comes from living according to your values, even if those values include living in a barrel and shouting at statues. It does not come from titles. Diogenes may have passed away barefoot, homeless, and penniless, but he left behind something far more resilient than gold, the unsettling truth that pierces your mind like a splinter and challenges you to laugh at yourself, or, at the very least, consider why you're not carrying a lantern. You would think that a man who publicly reprimanded Plato, slept in a jar, and barked at citizens would be a forgotten footnote in philosophy. However, in an illusion-based culture, Diogenes has come to represent radical honesty rather than insanity. It says something that we are still discussing him more than 2 millennia later. It asserts that despite the fact that truth lives in a barrel and stinks like onions, humans are nonetheless insatiably curious. Diogenes' life was provocative, which is why he matters now. What happens when you stop playing along? He dared to ask. What if you give up on pursuing fame, fortune, or even comfort, and simply live your life as it is, removing all pretense, deceit, and carefully constructed personas? What remains? Diogenes asserts that true freedom is what remains. His rejection of appearances is more powerful than ever in a culture that is based on appearance, whether it is Instagram or ancient Athens. He didn't merely criticize authority or money, he wondered why they were necessary. He has thus served as an inspiration to a wide range of intellectuals, including comedians, anarchists, and Stoics. He's the original minimalist, the spiritual grandpa of every "I resigned my 6-figure career to live in a van" narrative you see online. Even Diogenes' crudeness has a place. He exposed rather than offended with shock. He wanted people to feel the agony, since that's where contemplation starts. If you're more disturbed by someone relieving themselves in public than you are by corruption in government or greed in religion, then Diogenes would say your priorities are upside down. Even though his techniques were unorthodox, the main idea remains relevant today. Virtue is not something you buy, brand, or broadcast. It's how you live when no one's watching, or in Diogenes' case, when absolutely everyone is looking and you just don't care. He reminds us that knowledge doesn't always wear robes. Sometimes it laughs in your face, yells from a jar, and won't leave the sun. Diogenes challenges us to stand out in a world full with branding, noise, and stupidity, sincere, unadulterated, and slightly canine. And perhaps, just possibly, it is what makes him the most intelligent madman in history. Tension was roiling in the northern plains by the early 1870s, a gradual accumulation of land theft, broken promises, and cultural clashes. The Black Hills, which the Lakota Sioux refer to as Paha Sapa, were at its center. In the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, the U.S. government acknowledged this area as Lakota territory. In this example, forever lasted roughly 6 years, although on paper, the land was theirs forever. When gold was found in the Black Hills in 1874 by an expedition headed by none other than George Armstrong Custer, everything changed. As soon as word spread, thousands of prospectors desecrated sacred ground and broke the treaty by flooding into the area like flies to honey. Instead of enforcing its own deal, the government attempted to purchase the land from the Lakota. They declined. This was about survival, sovereignty, and the loss of their way of life, not just about wealth. The Lakota and their allies were now considered enemies by Washington. They were opposing, not bargaining. The U.S. Army was ordered to transfer all native groups onto reservations by January 31, 1876. Any non-compliant group would be viewed as adversaries. Because they were dispersed around large winter hunting grounds, many did not even get the message. Others just declined. They had no desire to give up their independence for a life of captivity and reliance. What was developing on the plains was a collision course rather than merely a dispute. Legendary leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse started to assemble a loose coalition of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. They were obligated to defend their territory, their people, and their way of life, even if they were not a recognized army. They anticipated war. The tribes were perceived as split and disorganized by U.S. military planners who were confident in their numbers and technology. They were completely mistaken. The warriors of the plains were extremely mobile, had a deep understanding of the environment, and were driven by the most profound of motives. The fuse was blazing, the powder keg was lit, and soon the conflict that would become the Battle of Little Bighorn was speeding into the past. The typical military officer was not George Armstrong Custer. He was a well-known figure by 1876, a fiery, controversial Civil War hero known for his audacity, carelessness, and hazardous addiction to fame. With his voluminous blonde hair, gaudy outfits, and penchant for publicity, Custer appeared more at home on stage than in combat. Nevertheless, he had gained both admiration and hatred for his audacity. Custer had served as a lieutenant colonel in the 7th U.S. Cavalry on the western frontier following the Civil War. His occupation? Implement federal Indian policy, which increasingly required evicting indigenous tribes from their lands, either quietly, if at all possible, or forcibly, if required. Custer was ready for a battle by 1876. A resounding military triumph could repair his reputation following a public spat with the administration of President Ulysses S. Grant, and his political aspirations were seething. He was pursuing significance rather than just Indians. Custer was told to join a three-pronged effort to find and defeat the so-called hostiles as hostilities with the Lakota and their allies increased. The intention was to enclose the indigenous settlements and subdue them. General George Crook's soldiers would advance from the south, General John Gibbon's troops would arrive from the west, and Custer's column would approach from the east. However, the strategy was dogged from the start by a lack of cooperation and overconfidence. The distances were great, the terrain rough, and the intelligence at best poor. Custer and the majority of U.S. officers thought they were up against a tiny, dispersed force of fighters. Unbeknownst to them, the greatest native army ever gathered on the plains, thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, had gathered for a summer meeting near the Little Bighorn River. As always, Custer wanted to get in first and take the credit. He disregarded orders to wait, turned down reinforcements, and refused to bring Gatling guns that would slow him down. Instead, he divided his forces into 3 battalions and advanced with his 600 soldiers in preparation for a surprise attack. It was bold, daring, and disastrously misguided, for what was ahead was not a shattered settlement of stragglers. It was a cohesive, hardened force prepared to protect its culture, and Custer was poised to gallop straight into legend and catastrophe with his trademark flair. Along the banks of the Little Bighorn River, something amazing was taking place while the U.S. Army operated based on inaccurate maps and presumptions. At first, thousands of Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho had assembled for a customary summer camp rather than for battle. It was a time for gathering as families and allies, hunting, resting, and performing ceremonies. However, the event was clouded by the political climate of 1876. The indigenous leaders were aware of the impending event. They had witnessed treaties being broken, buffalo herds going extinct, and railroads and settlers encroaching. They were aware that despite its seeming tranquility, this camp might quickly turn into a battlefield, and they had no intention of fleeing. Sitting Bull, a visionary leader and Hunkpapa Lakota holy man, was at the heart of this expanding coalition. He performed a fierce sun dance, a torturous ritual of prayer and sacrifice in the weeks preceding the fight. During the dance, Sitting Bull reportedly experienced a vision. He witnessed soldiers, broken and defeated, dropping into the camp like grasshoppers. This was prophecy to his disciples, not a metaphor. Then there was Crazy Horse, a fighter of nearly legendary courage and skill. In past conflicts, Crazy Horse had established himself as a fearless leader who was quiet, withdrawn, and devoted to defending his people. Soon after, he would demonstrate his abilities once more by storming straight into enemy lines with a combination of audacity and tactical skill. Key voices also came from other leaders such as Gall and Two Moons. Despite not being governed by a single, centralized authority, the tribe's exceptional cohesiveness during this time was noteworthy. They weren't just protecting land, they were also protecting freedom. There may have been between 8,000 and 10,000 Native Americans in the Little Bighorn Valley, including 500 to 2,000 warriors, according to varying estimates. They had excellent terrain knowledge, were well armed, many of them carried repeating rifles, and, most all, were defending their homes, families, and way of life. Custer had anticipated several hundred frantic fighters. He was about to confront a powerful alliance instead, one that was built out of spiritual resolve, ancestry, and a strong will to live. The storm was building. Custer and his 7th Cavalry departed the Rosebud River mouth on June 22, 1876, following what were thought to be traces leading to a neighboring native camp. They proceeded too quickly for 3 days, wearing out both men and horses. Custer was certain that if the locals realized the soldiers were approaching, they would disperse. Before General Terry or Gibbon could get up and take center stage, he intended to attack first, hit hard, and take the credit. But he was too rushed to exercise prudence. Custer was cautioned by scouts, including renowned Crow and Arikara warriors, that the hamlet in front of them was enormous and unlike anything they had ever seen. Some even scaled tall peaks and said, "Too many to count," as they returned with wide eyes. They begged Custer to hold off, to think it over. No, he didn't. Custer arrived to a ridge with a view of the Little Bighorn Valley early on June 25th. He could make out portions of the large camp from a distance, with teepees lining the river like a tiny city. Cooking flames emitted smoke, kids played, the horses grazed. However, what he perceived as a weak camp turned out to be a sleeping giant. Custer divided his 600-man unit, a mistake he made because he still thought he could surprise them. He dispatched 125 troops led by Captain Frederick Benteen to conduct scouting in the south. With 140 troops, Major Marcus Reno was given the command to attack the village's southernmost point. Custer himself, meanwhile, led roughly 210 men north in the hopes of pincer-moving the warriors and flanking the hamlet from behind. It was audacious, it was dangerous, and it was predicated on terribly incorrect premises. Custer had no idea that the warriors already knew the soldiers were coming. Lakota scouts had observed moving columns and dust trails. Before it had started, the element of surprise was gone. There were no terrified families fleeing when Reno's troops swooped down into the valley. They discovered more warriors than they had ever thought would be gathering. Instead of collapsing, the camp blossomed into a concerted resistance movement, spearheaded by the very individuals Custer had misjudged. That was when the U.S. myth of invincibility began. The army started to break. Custer led the assault directly into the heart of the 7th Cavalry, which was walking into a storm it couldn't escape. Around 3 p.m., Major Marcus Reno and his troops stormed the southern portion of the native camp on June 25, 1876. Panic was what they anticipated, warriors scurrying, women and children running. Instead, they encountered a well-organized and enraged resistance. The accusation disintegrated in a matter of minutes. Along the river, Reno's men dismounted amid the trees and began shooting. They were astonished, however, by the volume of returned fire. In addition to their sheer numbers, the warriors were swift, aggressive, and well-coordinated. With deadly accuracy, Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, often mounted, charged over the open terrain at a terrifying pace. Some carried Winchesters and Spencer repeating rifles, which were more sophisticated than the cavalry's single-shot carbines. Reno went into a frenzy. Rather than remain in his place, he issued a frantic command to mount and cross the river. Numerous soldiers were shot down and some drowned during the rush. A rout ensued from the retreat. Desperate to establish a defensive position, Reno's soldiers, disoriented and bleeding, stumbled up a bluff on the east side of the river. At that moment, reinforcements led by Captain Frederick Benteen came from the south. On top of what would become known as Reno Hill, he and Reno formed a rough perimeter. Low on water, encircled and constantly under fire, they dug in there. To the north, they could hear shooting in the distance, the sound of Custer's own doom coming to pass, but they had no idea what was going on. None of the messengers they dispatched came back. Native warriors, encouraged by Reno's retreat, rushed over the battlefield in the valley below. Spirits rose. It was the fulfillment of the prophecy. The invading force was not unbeatable. They were running away and more were on the way. U.S. military operations on the plains had been predictable until now. Native American tribes had come to anticipate swift attacks, overwhelming power, and severe reprisals. However, this was not like the others. The warriors were mobile, resolute, driven by vision and fury, and they were fighting on their own terms. Furthermore, Custer was moving northwards without realizing that the whole tactical system he was depending on had already fallen apart, while Reno was struggling to stay alive on the hilltop, uncertain of what had gone wrong. Strategy was no longer a factor in the war. It was now survival. Custer's time was running out. Unaware of the magnitude of the combat taking place behind them, Custer and his 210 men pushed northward, while Benteen fortified Reno Hill, and Reno's army fled in panic. Custer's unit, still believing that the hamlet might be attacked from several sides, advanced along high ground in the hopes of hitting the back of the village. The warriors, however, were aware of his approach. The alert had now reached every corner of the enormous camp. Hundreds of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors charged at Custer's column. Custer was confronted by a flood of mounted combatants rather than ladies and children to apprehend. While attempting to maintain defensive positions along the hills and ridge lines, his forces were soon surrounded. The fight's exact order is still up for discussion. No one from Custer's direct command survived. However, it is evident that the 7th Cavalry was overrun in a few short hours. Custer's men were outnumbered and outmaneuvered by the indigenous forces, who were commanded by Gall and Crazy Horse. The lines were torn apart by their aggressive tactics and better terrain knowledge. On what would become known as Last Stand Hill, the men attempted to take a position. Some fell alone, some in small groups, and some reportedly attempted to shoot themselves rather than be taken after being surrounded, out of ammunition, and unable to flee. According to native tales, the battle was swift and vicious. It was a collapse, not merely a struggle. Custer was shot in the head and chest and died in the last seconds. Along with his brothers Boston Custer and Tom Custer, he was discovered in a group of men. More than 200 men were wiped out to the last, and almost every soldier under his command was dead. Although it was a stunning and poignant victory for the indigenous warriors, there was no triumphant celebration. According to other stories, they were grieving instead of celebrating, realizing that even though they had won the fight, the war was far from done. This moment of glory would be greeted by retaliation when the U.S. Army returned. Custer, the fearless leader seeking legacy, had discovered it in annihilation rather than conquest after the relentless machine of westward expansion stalled for a single day on the undulating hills of Montana. On the evening of June 25th, when the dust had finally fallen, the Little Bighorn Hills were once again silent. Ammunition belts were strewn, fires raged, and more than 200 members of the 7th Cavalry, including George Armstrong Custer, and almost all of the officers he directly oversaw, were dead. Broken weapons, fallen horses, and the dead of warriors who had not anticipated it were all over the battlefield. Even while the native victory was total, it came with a sobering realization. It wasn't over yet. There was a spark. Enraged and embarrassed, the U.S. administration refused to condone what they would describe as a slaughter. Newspapers in the back east blared headlines about Custer's final stand, portraying the native warriors as ruthless attackers and him as a martyr. Conveniently, the background, the treaty transgressions, the gold rush into holy areas, and the combat's defensive nature were removed from the national narrative. Native families grieved their own losses in the days that followed. Even though they had won, they had also lost, and they were certain that the Americans would react quickly. Sitting Bull was among the leaders who exhorted the populace to act swiftly. As they prepared for the inevitable reprisal, they broke up the large camp and dispersed around the plains in smaller groups. Soon after, rearmed and strengthened American forces landed in the area. Washington's determination was only strengthened by the loss at Little Bighorn. The severity of the policies increased. Treaties were broken. More soldiers showed up. Domination, not negotiation, was the new objective. In order to avoid being captured, Sitting Bull eventually moved north to Canada, and Crazy Horse fought for another year before being slain in 1877 under dubious circumstances. Many tribes had their freedom shattered when they were pushed onto reservations, malnourished and outgunned. 2 days later, relief forces found the actual battleground. They discovered a gloomy and eerie environment. As part of a long-standing warrior practice to deny adversaries honor, many soldiers had had their uniforms and equipment taken away. Depending on tribal traditions and the severity of the conflict, some bodies were disfigured while others were left whole. But what had transpired was undeniable. Custer had left. For a brief moment, native resistance had accomplished the impossible, and the 7th Cavalry was completely destroyed. They had prevailed. There was more to the Battle of Little Bighorn than just a military conflict. History distorted and weaponized it into a symbol. In the face of overwhelming odds, it was a rare and difficult triumph for the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. It was an embarrassment that required immediate, ruthless retaliation from the American government and people. The story was soon distorted in the American imagination. The heroic general who made a final stand, Custer was changed from a careless glory seeker to a sad hero. A surge of patriotic mythology overshadowed the inequity of the U.S. invasion of treaty-protected territories, the intricacy of his choices, and the haughtiness of his strategies. The reality that the native triumph was a defensive struggle on native ground was obscured by the press's designation of it as a massacre. Native populations, however, had a radically different perspective on the fight. It was a time of solidarity, courage, and the fulfillment of prophecy. Before the dark shadow of reservation life fell in, the enormous encampment at the Little Bighorn symbolized one last, glimmering moment of freedom. Many saw the fight as a source of pride, a demonstration of tenacity and fortitude. It demonstrated that the native populations of the plains were active protectors of their environment rather than helpless victims. But that victory came quickly at a cost. Military operations become more intense in a matter of months. The Aboriginal food supply was purposefully destroyed by attacking the already devastated buffalo herds. The pursuit of tribes was unrelenting. Crazy Horse passed away in 1877. Even while Sitting Bull would live longer, he would ultimately perish in 1890, just a few days before the Wounded Knee massacre, which marked yet another terrible turning point in the erasure of native sovereignty. As a result, Little Bighorn's legacy became both uplifting and depressing. It brought to light the brutality of U.S. expansion, the unfulfilled promises, and the tenacity of a people who would not be silently wiped out. The battleground is now a national monument. Only Custer and his troops were honored there for many years, but more recently, memorials have been erected to honor the indigenous warriors who fought and lost their lives there, not as villains, but as heroes protecting their nations. If you're willing to hear more than one account of history, the hills remember both sides, the wind sings both songs, and Little Bighorn's legacy continues to speak. The Battle of Little Bighorn is notable in the grand scheme of American history as one of the few occasions when the underdog not only fought back, but triumphed. An empire was halted for a single day in 1876 by indigenous warriors. Their success was not based on wealth, technology, or numbers. They prevailed because of their bravery, solidarity, and unwavering determination to defend their way of life. The tragedy of Little Bighorn, however, is that history was not altered by this triumph. All it did was postpone it. It actually hastened the end. Washington was infuriated by Custer's spectacular defeat. The public's perception became more rigid. Where it had existed, sympathy for native complaints was buried behind waves of nationalism and retaliation. Funding for the military was boosted by Congress. With ruthless accuracy, the offensive against the Plains tribes grew more intense. The nomadic lifestyle that had characterized Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho civilization for centuries vanished in a matter of years. The land was divided, the reservations were divided, and the buffalo were all but extinct. Once resonating with hoofs and war yells, the hills were now silent. Little Bighorn, however, resisted fading. It has been recovered, recreated, and reinterpreted over the years. It began as a story of valiant sacrifice for many Americans. Over time, it began to represent injustice to others, of a country that declared resistance to be treasonous after breaking its word. One of the few battlegrounds where both sides are remembered today is this one, where not every marker points in the same direction. The fight continues to hold great symbolic meaning for indigenous peoples, as the last valiant stand of a free people, not as the start of defeat. They battled for everything that was being taken away from them, including their land, independence, and dignity, with all of their remaining strength. It remains a revered recollection, and Little Bighorn provides a challenging yet essential lesson for the rest of us. About power, concerning myth, concerning the price of conquest. It serves as a reminder that the winners do not always write history. Occasionally, it lies hidden beneath them, just waiting to be discovered. Custer may have received the honor in the end, but the Little Bighorn warriors received something much more enduring. We stood up and battled for the truth and the right to speak. The Forbidden City was not constructed overnight. It came into being via hard work, ambition, and a strong desire for power. In an effort to relocate the capital from Nanjing, the Yongle Emperor of the Ming dynasty ordered the building of a new imperial residence in Beijing in 1406. However, this would not be your typical palace. As a fortified city inside a city, it would eventually become the center of the Chinese Empire, where no secrets could escape its gates unchecked and no one could enter unless called. More than 1 million workers, artisans, and engineers contributed to the massive project over the course of the following 14 years. Just the supplies were gathered from all across the empire. Sichuan's golden Nanmu wood, enormous blocks of marble transported over icy rivers, and millions of flawlessly baked glazed roof tiles. The pride of an empire was cemented brick by brick. When constructed, the Forbidden City stretched almost 180 acres and housed over 900 buildings. Its layout followed rigorous Confucian ideals, symmetrical, ordered, hierarchical. Its center was the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where decrees thundered through the bureaucracy and emperors were crowned. Beyond the majesty, however, there was a deeper psychological goal. This was more than a house, it was a declaration. You are not surrounded by the emperor. He's above you. And don't get me wrong, it was strictly prohibited. The typical Beijinger has never set foot inside. Only with imperial approval could high officials enter. At each gate were guards. There were spies in every hallway. Markets and everyday life were thriving in the outlying city. But within the scarlet walls, ritual reigned supreme, and time slowed. It was a secretive, ritualistic universe that was shielded from the chaos of everyday existence. However, the Forbidden City was also a pressure cooker beneath its crimson columns and golden rooftops. Despite its grandeur, it was constructed to keep authority concentrated, insulate the emperor from political and physical threats, and protect him. It would eventually turn into a site of mystery, treachery, and eerie whispers. Yes, it was a palace, but it also served as a backdrop for 5 centuries of ambition, empire, and gradual disintegration. It gleamed from the outside. It observed from within, never forgetting who passed through its corridors. The emperor, the Son of Heaven, who served as a living link between the divine and the mortal world, sat in the center of the Forbidden City. However, despite his cosmic might, the king frequently lived a very solitary life. The emperor was not only shielded by the Forbidden City, but it also engulfed him. His entire life was predetermined with oppressive accuracy. He had attendants to dress him, he woke to music, and he had a ritualized, almost theatrical regimen. Poison samples were taken from meals. Ministers knelt before him and read out documents. It took many escorts and ceremonial approval to even take a walk in the gardens. Everything was observed. Nothing happened on its own. The emperor was far from free. Even though he held the highest position in the hierarchy, he was imprisoned by the same system that had promoted him. The emperor seldom came into contact with the outer world, surrounded by layers of eunuchs, ministers, consorts, and spies. Particularly in later dynasties, the vast apparatus of court protocol frequently suppressed his ability to act autonomously, filtered his knowledge, and controlled his contacts. Some emperors, like Yongle or Kangxi, who ruled with a firm hand and were adept at bureaucracy, dealt with this with merciless efficiency. Others became detached, paranoid, or decadent, and became like a gilded ghost lost in their own palace. Some rulers remained inside the Forbidden City for months or even years without ever leaving its walls. They could have just as easily ruled from the moon. Access to the emperor was strictly regulated even within the palace. Senior officials might have to wait for an audience for days. Heaven helped the servant who stepped over the wrong threshold, and family members had little interaction. What you could see, how you bowed, and even where you might stand were all governed by protocol. The emperor might theoretically order legions with a single word. In reality, he frequently found it difficult to determine who to believe or what was actually going on outside his walls. The throne was encircled by curtains, layers upon layers of ritual and mystery, and it may have been carved from jade and placed above dragons. The Forbidden City shrouded its emperor in silence while crowning him with riches. An unseen army of eunuchs, not generals or ministers, stood behind each throne in the Forbidden City. Eunuchs, castrated men who worked in the court, started off as lowly servants but rose to become some of the most influential and feared people in imperial China. Eunuchs represented a peculiar middle ground in a world where men were viewed as threats and women as cloistered. They were close to the emperor, but also strategically helpful because they were unable to form competing dynasties. Their initial responsibilities were straightforward: overseeing palace tasks, delivering letters, and taking care of imperial clothes. However, eunuchs started to fill the void as the emperors grew more isolated, particularly during the Ming and Qing dynasties. They censored information, restricted access to the emperor, and eventually assumed complete control of administrative duties. Generals were not the only people with power. In ways that even his own family did not, others had the emperor's ear. Power also brought corruption and ambition. Eunuchs in the Forbidden City had a history of ups and downs. Every faithful servant had a conspirator influencing imperial choices, stifling critics and accumulating riches. From behind silkscreens, some eunuchs, such as Wei Zhongxian in the late Ming era, essentially controlled the empire. Entire ministries were terrified of his whispers, his adversaries vanished, and his pals were elevated. However, eunuchs' power extended beyond politics. It was intimate. Since they were young, they have taken care of the emperor, watched him develop, and frequently served as enablers, mentors, or surrogate fathers. They were always present in the emperor's court, study, and rooms. The eunuchs were frequently the ones who knew and occasionally took advantage of the emperor's loneliness. Their lives, however, were anything but opulent. Many boys, frequently from low-income families, were castrated against their will as boys in an attempt to guarantee them a place in the palace. With luck and guile, those who made it through the grueling operation and years of arduous labor could advance in rank. However, Confucian academics and military leaders always regarded them with distrust, tolerated them, used them, and eventually blamed them when things went wrong. The eunuchs were the silent hands that moved the pieces in a city that was founded on formality and mystery. Not pawns or kings, but something much more intricate and perilous. The Forbidden City's most hidden area, the inner court, was located beyond its imposing gates and beautiful halls. Nestled deep behind the crimson walls lay the emperor's private realm, a labyrinth of palaces, gardens, and sleeping quarters. Here, dynasties, consorts, concubines, and offspring took precedence over governmental affairs. Here, politics assumed a new, more personal dimension in which bloodlines, attractiveness, and jealousy were the dominant factors. The emperor's 3 main palaces, plus the empress and concubines' 6 homes, made up the inner court. But don't let the perfumed gardens and placid names deceive you. This hideaway was anything from tranquil. Dozens, even hundreds of women were vying for favor, making it a battlefield. The milieu of the inner court was one of calculating ambition, whispered alliances, and hidden threats. The empress, the emperor's lawful wife, was at the top. She was not always his favorite, but she had status and formality. Concubines were frequently the source of the emperor's affection and heirs, and their status may change drastically based on a single rumor, a pregnancy, or a glance. Some became powerful after having sons. Others vanished into darkness, their futures silently extinguished, their names forgotten. Senior eunuchs and palace ladies served as messengers, middlemen, and sometimes spies. Nothing occurred in secret. Nothing was overlooked. Despite having little autonomy, court ladies used charm, deceit, and occasionally poison to gain influence in more covert ways. Sometimes a consort would become so popular that she was able to rule through the emperor. One of the most renowned was Empress Dowager Cixi, who climbed from low-ranking concubine to virtual ruler of China for nearly half a century. Inside these confines, behind closed doors, in velvet robes with a sharp mind wrapped in patience, was where her power started. The inner court was a place of art, music, and sophistication, but to outsiders it was quiet and fragrant. Behind the painted screens and latticed windows, however, was a pressure chamber where ancestry, survival, and rank clashed. Power didn't just march in boots and robes in the Forbidden City. At times it waited to attack, while tiptoeing around moonlit hallways in embroidered slippers and grinning charmingly. Every action, including every step, bow, and incense gift, held significance within the Forbidden City. Nothing was done carelessly. This wasn't just a palace, it was a magnificent machine. Furthermore, the emperor was more than a man. He was the son of heaven, the bridge between the earthly and the celestial. This implied that his every action carried cosmic significance. Power wasn't the only factor. It had to do with order. Long before dawn, officials would line up at the Meridian Gate in anticipation of the early court audience. These were very well choreographed short sessions. Ministers presented their memorials with a studied humility, kneeled, and spoke only when called upon. They were strong men outside the palace. The emperor's feet were shadowed within. In order to maintain harmony between heaven and earth, the emperor presented sacrifices to the Temple of Heaven during the winter solstice festival, which was one of the most elaborate customs. There was no choice in these rites. They were political theatre on a religious magnitude. Bad weather, a forgotten step, or a failed ceremony were all interpreted as indicators that the mandate of heaven might be waning. Every element of life within the palace was governed by rituals, weddings, funerals, births, even dinners. Several officials examined the emperor's meal, tasted it for poison, and arranged it in accordance with rigid customs. Unauthorized menu changes by the emperor might cause havoc in both the court and the chefs. Silence, however, was arguably the most telling rite. If you weren't talked to, you didn't talk to the emperor. You failed to meet his gaze. Even his relatives stood up, bowed, and backed off. Distance was required. There was little intimacy. Ritual preoccupation turned into a double-edged sword over time. On one hand, it preserved continuity, structure, and legitimacy across centuries. On the other hand, it prevented people from making decisions. Ministers argued etiquette while the world outside shifted. Foreign powers advanced. A revolution sparked. But inside the Forbidden City, the bureaucrats were still fighting about the right number of ceremonial steps for a royal procession. The rituals that previously solidified authority began to calcify it. They maintained the empire's rotation while also immobilizing it, much like the hands of a finely crafted clock. The show went on behind those golden walls, perfect, accurate, and more irrelevant. Beneath the Forbidden City's golden tiles and lacquered beams was a world of whispers, shadows, an unending suspicion that was not depicted in art. The fortifications were effective at keeping out adversaries, but they were unable to keep ambition in. Furthermore, soldiers at the gates weren't the biggest threat in a palace where authority was centralized, inherited, and frequently unstable. They worked in your chamber as servants. Spying was not merely widespread, it was put into a formal setting. Eunuchs informed one another. In coded whispers, palace servants gossiped. Even concubines had informants who used extortion or bribery to obtain information about their competitors. Most of the time, the emperor was unsure of which words to believe, but his word was law. It was normal to be paranoid. They opened letters, there were overheard conversations, a casual comment could be construed as treason, false charges proliferated, ministers could be expelled based on a rumor one day, then exalted the next. Overnight, families vanished. Knowing what would happen if they resisted, some people decided to end their lives rather than go to trial. This invisible battle was fought by the eunuchs, who also served as its enforcers. Some established spy networks that rivaled secret police, while others were emperor-loyal and protective. The notorious Eastern Depot, a eunuch-run espionage organization, was given terrifying authority under the Ming dynasty. The power to make an arrest, question someone, and carry out an execution without first contacting the civil administration. Torture was commonplace like teeth, confessions were pulled out. Even while court officials and scholars disliked the eunuch's power, they were not immune to intrigue. Every promotion, marriage alliance and imperial decree was a move in an ongoing game of chess played at the court. Even the emperor was occasionally used as a pawn, particularly if he was young, ill, or uninterested in holding power. The strings were pulled by dowagers and regents who struck at night and smiled during the day. Success in this world required tact, silence, and a perfect memory of allegiances. A one slip-up, simply an unguarded glance, may be deadly. Nevertheless, many continued to plot, because being close to the throne was the greatest reward in the Forbidden City, and losing it was the worst fall. Under the crimson walls and rituals was a city that merely waited and watched, never really sleeping. With its red walls that had not been weakened by time and its golden roofs that glowed in the sunlight, the Forbidden City may have appeared to last forever. On the inside, however, dynasties arose and fell with frightening regularity. At close range, power that seemed heavenly at a distance frequently proved to be potentially lethal. Additionally, the empire did not always collapse on a battlefield. It was talked out of existence by those closest to the throne as it fell in a silent hallway behind a sealed door. The Forbidden City was constructed during the approximately 3-century-long Ming dynasty. However, by the 1600s, peasant uprisings, internal corruption, and its own bureaucracy were making it stutter. Famine and instability were simmering outside the palace, which had devolved into a labyrinth of eunuch domination and ritual obsessions. The final Ming emperor hung himself in the palace gardens in 1644, as rebel armies surrounded Beijing. He left behind a palace ready for conquest, and a note regretting his failure. The Qing dynasty was founded by the Manchus, a foreign force from the northeast. Surprisingly, they decided to maintain the Forbidden City as their capital, incorporating their own customs while modifying its. The language, clothing, and traditions changed, but the building stayed the same. Red walls maintained the appearance of continuity by absorbing the shock of change once more. For an additional 268 years, the Qing reigned from the Forbidden City, experiencing both periods of great wealth and catastrophic downfall. The late Qing emperors, particularly in the 19th century, found it difficult to adjust to domestic uprisings, technological stagnation, Western imperialism, and contemporary challenges. Empress Dowager Cixi, meanwhile, reigned covertly, actively influencing court politics while rejecting reforms that could have prevented the fall of the empire. The Forbidden City had become more of a museum than a seat of authority by the time Puyi, the boy emperor, took the throne in 1908. Over 2 millennia of imperial control ended in 1912 with the fall of the Qing dynasty. Strangely enough, though, Puyi was permitted to stay in the Forbidden City for an additional 13 years, like a ghost prowling the remains of his own history. Despite the absence of the emperors, the city remained stately, hollowed out, and haunted by the ghosts of long-gone empires. The thrones inside the walls had perished, but the walls themselves had survived. The Forbidden City ought to have been quiet after the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912. Rather, it began one of the most peculiar periods in its 500-year history. The monarchy had vanished. The new China was a republic. And yet there was still a young emperor inside the red walls. 6-year-old Puyi, still wearing dragon robes, still submitting to pointless ceremonies, and still in charge of nothing. The outcome of a political agreement was this strange setup. Puyi was let to stay in the Forbidden City's inner court, isolated from Beijing's evolving streets by the new republican government. Outside, civilization was transformed by revolution, and warlords fought for dominance. Time stopped within. Eunuchs went about their work. The way meals were served was ceremonial. A monarch without a monarchy, a youngster living inside a dream already shattered. The emperor woke up, clothed, and was bowed to. Puyi, however, was not blind. He started to wonder about the world as he got older. Newspapers smuggled inside the castle were read by him. He saw jets soar over the sky. He lived in a museum of diminishing grandeur while modernity hummed outside his walls, and he realized that the empire was really gone, even if no one acknowledged it out loud. Curiosity, discontent, and ultimately resistance were fostered by his seclusion. A large, suspicious fire that destroyed priceless items started in the castle in 1923. Hundreds of eunuchs were expelled when Puyi accused them of stealing and sabotaging. Overnight, centuries of palace customs disappeared. People were leaving the Forbidden City. A warlord by the name of Feng Yuxiang eventually drove Puyi out of the palace completely by 1924. The gates from which emperors had ruled for generations were used to take the now young guy out. He was a misplaced figure enveloped in the memory of lost authority, conveyed in a rickshaw with no throne or honor guard. However, Puyi's tale did not stop there. Later, he would work with the Japanese, rise to power in Manchuria, and then be apprehended, detained, and retaught by the communist government. He worked as a gardener in Beijing in his last years, caring for flowers while living in peace close to the palace that had previously characterized him. As the last resident of the Forbidden City, Puyi took the last breath of the empire with him as he departed. The Forbidden City now shows its secrets rather than concealing them. Millions of people can now access what was once closed to almost all of China. Now known as the Palace Museum, it serves as a tribute to the complex webs of history, power, and identity that molded a civilization in addition to imperial majesty. Today, as they enter its gates, guests pass beneath the same imposing crimson walls that previously frightened diplomats and reverberated with eunuch footsteps. The dragon patterns are still as strong as ever, and the golden roofs continue to shine in the sunlight. Today, however, you'll find tour guides, selfie sticks, and schoolchildren with notebooks in place of soldiers and courtiers. More than 1.8 million antiques, scrolls, paintings, ceramics, ceremonial clothing, weapons, and emperors' and empresses' personal property are kept in the Forbidden City. The silence of chambers that previously determined the fate of millions of people, however, is what remains most when the items are gone. Large courtyards, empty thrones, and shuttered doors all convey tales that are more potent than any exhibit label. The complex has been astonishingly intact thanks to restoration efforts, although the Forbidden City has not only been preserved but also undergone transformation. It is a national icon, a living museum, and ironically, a location where public education is facilitated by the memories of dictatorship. Ironically, a palace designed to exclude has grown to be one of the world's most visited destinations. The site's deeper significance endures despite the tourists' talk and camera flashes. Emperors used to stand above a kneeling court in the Hall of Greatest Harmony, and you can sense it there. You sense it in the inner court's shadowed hallways where fates were determined by whispers. In the gardens where lone emperors once roamed among rock sculptures, yearning for a world they could not touch, you can sense it. The Forbidden City reflects grandeur, control, vulnerability, and perseverance, making it a mirror of China in many respects. It is a framework for comprehending how history influences the present, not merely a holdover from the past. Not as a seat of authority anymore, but as a witness to everything that transpired after the empire's demise. It has witnessed every episode, from isolation to revolution to public remembrance.